So I'm Sarah Ingalls. I'm the local history librarian here at the Bloomington Public Library, and tonight we'll be exploring the Kickapoo tribe who inhabited this part of central Illinois when the first Euro-American settlers arrived in the early 1920s. Joining us is Bill Kemp. He has served as a librarian for the not-for-profit McLean County Museum of History for 20 years. He has graduate degrees from the University of Illinois Springfield and Illinois State University. The McLean County Museum of History is a nationally accredited, award-winning museum dedicated to telling the rich story of McLean County through programs for all ages. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this, so feel free to type questions and comments in the chat during the program, and our speaker will address those questions at the end of the presentation. So now I'll hand this over to Bill.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here with everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your Thursday evening to be with me. Heads up, I am giving a version of this program Tuesday, November 14th at Heartland Community College in Normal. The class is full. There are no remaining empty seats, but if you are attending that class, there is no need whatsoever to sit through this evening's proceedings. So if you're signed up for the Heartland class, now is the time to check out of this one. You don't need to hear a version of this twice, trust me. And I would be remiss if I did not mention, and I hope everyone, the sound quality is okay, that Greg Coos, my former boss, Director Emeritus, Executive Director Emeritus of the McLean County Museum of History, is giving a talk on the Kickapoo on the Upper Mackinac. This is next Thursday at 6:30, and that's sponsored by the Illinois Horticulture Center through Illinois State University. Greg Coos is an outstanding researcher, and in his recent one-volume history of McLean County, if you don't have a copy, you need to get one. The first chapter is titled Native American Sovereignty, right? And Greg pours in a lot of fresh, hard, primary source, secondary source research to kind of tell the tale. So if you're interested in this, please consider joining Greg's program next Thursday. Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to get right to the business at hand. And now there we go. Okay. My screen was frozen up for a second. I apologize. The McLean County Museum of History, my employer, the old courthouse in downtown Bloomington, recognizes that what we now call McLean County is the ancestral land of many Native groups, going all the way back to the Paleo Indians some 12,000 years ago. The Paleo Indians following the retreating ice sheet to hunt the megafauna, the mastodons and the woolly mammoths and other beasts, right? And that's just the beginning of this epic story of human habitation in what we now know as East Central Illinois. So over those thousands and thousands of years, a series of distinct native cultures will emerge, thrive, evolve, and then would be subsumed or superseded by other cultures. 12,000 years of human habitation. Let's compress that into one calendar year. So Euro-Americans, I'm talking about myself, permanent white settlement occurs in what is today McLean County in the early 1820s. So 200 years, right? We're in that kind of anniversary period, if you will. So Euro-Americans arrive on the scene, if we were to compress 12,000 years into one calendar year, in the last week of the last month, right? And in the final days of the last week of the last month of that calendar year. So indeed, right, written history is rather brief on this stage. On December 23rd, 1812, during the War of 1812, William Forsyth, who was the Indian agent in Peoria, sent an assessment of the Kickapoo to General William Clark in St. Louis, William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. So this is the Indian agent in Peoria sending an assessment of the Kickapoo to St. Louis. the Kickapoo were menacing American interests at the time, right? So this is the assessment, quote, "They are, the Kickapoo, a proud and haughty nation of Indians prone to insult. They think that their dogs or horses are equal in value to any person of any other nation. They show no mercy when they have power in their own hands and will talk with indifference to all mankind, white or Indian." So here we get a glimpse, right, of the unconquerable nature of the Kickapoo people, for unlike the Illinois and other dissipated tribes, the Kickapoo avoid complete cultural and political collapse. They consistently oppose forced removal and acculturation, yes, genocide at times, and by doing so help ensure their survival into the 21st century. The three paintings we see here were done by Florence Harris in 1906, I believe. I've got the caption right there, yes. She was an art student, and these are based on the more famous George Catlin's in the 19th century. George Catlin, the famous Americana artist. So these particular pieces are in our own collection. The single best study of the Kickapoo recently in this stretch of Illinois would be the Kickapoo of the Rhodes site, a historic Kickapoo village on the Illinois Prairie, written by Mark J. Wagner, and it came out in 2011. And it's a study of the Rhodes site, which was a large Kickapoo village on the eastern edge of present-day Lincoln, Illinois, and Logan County. It's a rather dense archaeological study, but yet there's several narrative chapters which really take a deep dive into Kickapoo history in central Illinois. Okay, this map illustrates the fluidity of Native American history with the appearance of colonial powers, empires, first the Spanish and Dutch, French, English, and then, of course, the American empires on the North American continent, right? Cataclysmic ripples will impact Native Americans, Native peoples, long before the arrival of the physical arrival of say, a conquistador or a missionary or a settler or a farmer or a militiaman, right? Europeans carried with them diseases which indigenous Americans were wholly ill-equipped to face: smallpox and measles and whooping cough, chickenpox, bubonic plague, typhus, and malaria, which created the greatest human holocaust in all of human history. There's an estimated die-off of 90 to 95% of all people in the Americas, South, Central, and North America, primarily because of disease. European colonial powers also bring with them iron and steel, manufactured cloth and firearms, and then calamitously, right, trade routes and markets spanning the globe, linking South America to the gold trade, the Caribbeans to sugar, and in the case of the Kickapoo, it would be the fur trade. So this is a chaotic, violent period in indigenous history, right? The Kickapoo are being squeezed by the Iroquois in the east and the Sioux on the west, and they turn southward into Illinois, playing a role in the decline of the Illinois Confederation. So when the first white settlers arrived, permanent white settlement in the early 1820s in what we call McLean County today, settlers assumed that the Kickapoo really had been here since time immemorial, right? Time doesn't really change for Native Americans. They're children of nature. So that was the belief. Little did they know that because of this period of just utter upheaval and violence, that the Kickapoo themselves were recent arrivals to central Illinois in the mid-1700s. So to simplify somewhat, the Kickapoo in Illinois divide into two autonomous bands, semi-autonomous bands or groups. The Vermilion Band is along the western drainage of the Wabash River in eastern Illinois. And then there's the Prairie Band from the headwaters of the Sangamon River in present-day eastern McLean County, westward to Lake Peoria, which is a wide spot in the Illinois River north of present-day downtown Peoria, down to Logan County. I'd mentioned the Rhodes site, but the Kickapoo ranged far and wide. To talk about a geographic limits to these bands is a fool's errand, right? This is an early map, one of the earliest, if not the earliest maps of Illinois, right? Illinois becomes a state in 1818. There's no McLean County yet. Let's enlarge this map, shall we? Notice there's no Euro-American settlements noted, no trading posts or wagon roads, nothing but a Kickapoo village large enough to draw the attention of this map maker. At this time, we know that the Kickapoo were establishing seasonal homes. So scattered family and kin groups would gather in summer villages, such as this one, what we now know today is the Grand Village of the Kickapoo, just north and a little east of present-day Leroy in eastern McLean County. That's what we're looking at here, right? So they would gather in summer villages, the Kickapoo would, and then come cold weather, disperse in their own winter camps. Summer villages would include cemeteries, council houses, dance grounds, sweat lodges, menstrual huts, scaffolds for drying corn, and agricultural fields tended by family groups, which would be 5 to 6 acres. We know that the Kickapoo raised 4 to 5 variety of corn, as well as other things, squash and beans, of course. And at the Grand Village site, I believe there's evidence of tobacco. Generally speaking, summer villages were occupied from April to October, but that could depend, of course. And after harvest, men would embark on winter hunts that might last 3 to 4 months. This is a rare and historically rich bound collection of hand-drawn McLean County Township plats we have in our collection. One of the gems, many gems we have in the archives of the McLean County Museum of History. And these are hand-drawn maps based on the notes from the first surveyors that fanned out through what is today East Central Illinois. So McLean County, what we know as McLean County, was first surveyed in the early 1820s. And here's a plat book with those surveys. And it offers just a wonderful snapshot of a landscape pre-contact, that is prior to the arrival of permanent Euro-American settlement, a landscape prior to its utter transformation. So on the left, we get a full county map. I've squared off Arrowsmith Township in yellow and circled the Grand Village in red. That band of green running to the west of Arrowsmith Township and the Grand Village is Old Town Timber. So the blobs outlined in green in that map are timbered tracts or wooded groves, right? McLean County, being a finger of the Grand Prairie, was about 90% tall grass prairie, soggy prairie, but about 10% of that was in timber, and Old Town Timber was one of the largest such groves in McLean County. It ranged more than 14,000 acres. So this plat book includes the 30 townships in McLean County, including to the right here, we see the plat for Arrowsmith Township. And here's an enlargement, and lo and behold, there's the old Kickapoo town, because by this time when the surveyor comes through, the village had been abandoned, right? But prior to that, we know that the Grand Village population during tribal councils and such could soar to several thousand Kickapoo. Okay, let's look at a modern day map. This is the topography of McLean County. I have circled again the Grand Village of the Kickapoo, the summer village, the general area in red. The most striking topographical feature in McLean County is the Bloomington Moraine, which courses through the center of the county. That's that orange, yellowish band, right? What is that? That's a large, wide ridge line rising some 100 feet or so above the surrounding prairie. And it was created during the retreat of the 1 mile thick ice sheet that used to be right here, right? During the last ice age, which ended, or you could say melted away, right? 25,000 to 11,000 years ago. So placing a village here, right, on a rise, you are high and dry with an expansive view of much of the surrounding landscape, backed by a large timbered tract was really a wise decision. The Kickapoo, right? In many ways, were far wiser than we are today. So they knew exactly what they were doing. We take a lot of things for granted today, right? And one of those would be a dry land, right? We live in a world of concrete and asphalt, but to be high and dry meant quite a lot at this time. And there's a view atop the Bloomington Moraine taken last September. County Highway 36, best known as the Leroy Lexington Blacktop, and the view here is southward toward Leroy down the south slope of the moraine. We can also look at a watershed map of McLean County, and I've circled the Grand Village site in red. I hope everybody's following me here. The Bloomington Moraine, given it's a ridge over the lower prairie, splits north and south McLean County into two watersheds, the Mackinac and the Sangamon. Think about a miniature continental divide, right? The Mackinac to the north and the Sangamon to the south. They both obviously flow into the Illinois River and hence to the Mississippi and down to the Gulf. So the Grand Village, high and dry though it was in proximity to the low swampy ground of the Sangamon River headwaters, rich in resources and offering Kickapoo things like waterfowl to eat, mussels, everything from duck fat to long reeds needed for mat making and the construction of summer houses. So yeah, as I always chide Lincoln scholars that I bump into from time to time on my job, right? One of the great legendary mythical romantic rivers in American history, the Sangamon, right, originates in McLean County. So let's take pride in that. If you're from McLean County, the origin in fact is just north of present day Ellsworth, right? The romantic Sangamon River, captured of course in John Ford's beautiful film, not historically accurate in any way, but aesthetically a work of art. Young Mr. Lincoln, which came out in 1939. That's Henry Fonda as young Mr. Lincoln, and Pauline Moore as the ill-fated Anne Rutledge, right? And that's supposedly the Sangamon River in the background, but this is being filmed somewhere in California, I presume. Yes. Again, the Sangamon River. Let's take a look at the origin of the river. Not so romantic, sadly, right? And there is the river flowing eastward, little more than a channelized drainage ditch. But soon enough, the Sangamon River will take on more character. This photograph comes from a remarkable collection of photographs of Kickapoo from Brown County, Kansas, dating to 1906 and held in the archives where I am right now, in fact, the McLean County Museum of History, and more on that collection in a moment. Here's a cutaway of pole and bark house in the museum's Making a Home exhibit. It's one of 5 permanent exhibits we have in the main floor of our the museum here. For the Kickapoo, the main wintertime activity entailed the harvesting of deer, raccoon, muskrat, and beaver for food, hides, and pelts. But with the arrival of the French, the Kickapoo began participating in the fur trade. So beaver and other furs were now harvested by the Kickapoo in exchange for French goods from a French licensed trader. And the Kickapoo would later deal with British and then American licensed traders. This empire of goods would shape in the most profound ways relations between Euro-Americans and indigenous peoples in Illinois and throughout the Americas, right? So when it came to trade goods, though, the Kickapoo were not passive recipients, we need to emphasize, of European industry and technology. Instead, they shaped as best they could this fraught relationship to their benefit. For example, they rejected refined white earthenware dishes. They rejected most European style clothing, though they liked European textiles to make their own clothing. And they rejected livestock, such as hogs. They wanted nothing to do with that. Yet the Kickapoo would also meld and reinterpret Euro-American material culture. They would use iron tools and, as I said, make clothing using Western textiles. The Kickapoo also hunted with guns, right? And they were utterly dependent on firearms. So that means guns and also gunpowder, lead balls, and gun flints. Given resistance to Euro-American designs on their lands and lifeways, it's not surprising, right, that the Kickapoo were enthusiastic supporters of Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, and their grand alliance against the Americans from 1811 to 1813. In fact, Native American historian R. David Edmonds noted that the conservative Kickapoo villages of central Illinois were the, quote, seed beds for the Prophet's influence in Illinois. And in fact, the Grand Village was likely the site for an intertribal conference with Tecumseh in attendance. So the War of 1812 pitted the United States against England and many native tribes, including the Kickapoo, because the Kickapoo rightly understood that the Americans as the greater, more immediate threat to their existence, more than the British. Territorial Governor Ninian Edwards will then head a force of some 360 militia and regular army from Fort Russell, that's Edwardsville today, to the indigenous settlements in and around Lake Peoria. And once there, Edwards' combined force would burn to the ground Kickapoo and Potawatomi villages, all the while massacring women and children and taking or destroying, quote, 4,000 bushels of corn, a prodigious quantity of beans and dried meat, guns, bags of gunpowder, flints, and then 80 horses and 200 brass kettles, and on and on. There are other terms for this, of course. Today we would call this ethnic cleansing or something worse. This war to subdue and exterminate the Kickapoo and other native bands continued into the spring of 1813, when an abandoned Grand Village was looted and burned to the ground by 3 companies of Illinois Rangers. In the 1819 Treaty of Edwardsville, the Kickapoo ceded their lands in central Illinois. And in exchange for that, they were promised land along the Osage River in southwest Missouri. So you had some 2,000 Kickapoo relocate to Missouri, though a few hundred or more individuals led by several Kickapoo leaders, most prominently the Kickapoo prophet Kennecott, and more on him in a moment, peacefully and quietly refused to go. And I think Greg Coos, a director emeritus of the McLean County Museum of History, who's going to talk next Thursday, sponsored by the Illinois Horticulture Center at ISU, is going to talk about this in depth. So yes, we're looking at the first surveys of McLean County. Here is a plat of what is today Lexington Township, and it's really a lost world, right? But the surveyors, in a way, were the harbingers of doom, at least from the perspective of Native people, right? We have to think of the public land survey system, which enabled federal surveyors to what? To lay a geometric grid over a natural landscape. That's what they were doing when they were surveying this land. Such a system made possible the efficient, brutally efficient transfer of public domain land into private hands, right? It was an engine of development, of settlement, right? Of economic muscle. But for Native Americans, it was an engine of destruction. So let's enlarge this image. Again, in 1824, the first federal surveyor of the township of Lexington, and we see noted here, circled in red, Kickapoo Town along the Mackinac River, and that green band along the Mackinac would be the Mackinac Timber. Everything else would be prairie, and circled in yellow would be the Delaware town. About 200 Delaware people settled along the upper Mackinac in 1819, and they proved generally more accommodating to Euro-American lifeways than the Kickapoo. But we're going to have to turn our attention to that Kickapoo town. Yes, the 1819 Treaty of Edwardsville was supposed to remove all Kickapoo from central Illinois, yet a sizable number a Vermilion band, Kickapoo, led by Kennecott, rejected that treaty. And instead of heading to Missouri, they settled along the Mackinac River, 3 miles southeast of today's Lexington. And then in March of 1829, early in the spring, American settler John Patton and his family move into what they mistakenly thought was this abandoned village. So then the Kickapoo return and promptly evict the Patton family. There's no bloodshed. In fact, the Kickapoo agree to help the Patton family build a notched log cabin on the other side of the Mackinac River, because John Patton was said to be valued for his skillful metalwork. So on June 10th, 1829, we know the date because there's reminiscences. That's 194 years ago. June 1829, 10 settlers and an undetermined number of Kickapoo and Delaware gather together to help John Patton build this one-room log cabin, the Patton cabin, which was subsequently enlarged, moved, dismantled, one time stored, and then finally relocated to a park in Lexington where it sits today. And it's the oldest building, I believe, in McLean County. It underwent extensive restoration in the mid-1990s, and about 60% of the original 1829 walls remain. It's really a remarkable reminder of the interconnection between Euro-Americans and the indigenous world. As the Kickapoo prophet, Kennecott, he melded traditional Kickapoo belief in Roman Catholicism, and he created a faith heavy on sin and penitence. This is a 1906 Florence Harris painting based on a George Catlin. And there's a prayer stick, which Kennecott used in some ways as Catholics would use a rosary, right? And Kennecott's followers were known as the praying Kickapoo. So by the late 1820s, this is a decade after the Treaty of Edwardsville, right? A sizable number of prairie band Kickapoo, some 150 Potawatomi, joined Kennecott's band in today's Livingston County, first at Indian Grove and then at Oliver's Grove near the Vermilion River. So you'll have approximately in the late 1820s, 700 Native people occupying about 100 or so traditional houses in what is today southern Livingston County, a decade after the Treaty of Edwardsville. And then in July of 1831, this is after the winter of deep snow, which was a particularly scary winter, right, which was difficult to survive. The praying band of Indians, so-called, shared a so-called Thanksgiving feast in the council house at Oliver's Grove with area settlers. So you had this feast after the winter of deep snow between white settlers and Kennecott and his followers. I don't mean to make too much of this. Greg, I believe, will talk more about this, but here you see a glimpse, if only a glimpse, of accommodation, coexistence between indigenous people and settlement. That was not, of course, to last much longer. In 1831-32, there was already a split among the Kickapoo as how best to confront ongoing American designs on the Kickapoo land and life. So when war came in 1832, the Black Hawk War, 100 Kickapoo warriors from where? From Oliver's Grove joined Black Hawk, and there they remained with the Sauk leader until the bloody end in 1832. And this war marked the end of accommodation, federal or otherwise, to indigenous people and the Kickapoo in central Illinois. So Kennecott signs the 1832 Treaty of Castor Hill, and he'll leave central Illinois for Kansas with 500 Kickapoo and Potawatomi. So you had 500 indigenous people in central Illinois as late as 1832. The Treaty of Castor Hill established new reservation land for the Kickapoo in Kansas. Wait a minute, Bill. Didn't you say that the Kickapoo had signed a treaty in 1819 and had moved to Missouri? Well, land-hungry whites already had designs on that land, so the Kickapoo were once again forcibly removed to Kansas, right? Groups of Kickapoo would eventually leave Kansas and establish more culturally conservative bands to the south, Oklahoma, and then Texas and Mexico. Let's move ahead a little bit. McLean County Museum of History's collections include a set of photographs taken of the Kickapoo on reservation land in Brown County, Kansas in October of 1906. For these remarkable photographs, we have this guy, Milo Custer, to thank, for it was under his auspices. Well, it was under the auspices of the McLean County Historical Society. Now we call it the McLean County Museum of History. He organized a research trip to the Kansas Kickapoo. He was the custodian, the first paid employee of what's today the museum. He was really the curator. He had an interest in Native Americans. So he gets bankrolled to head out there for a research trip in 1906, and he stays 12 days in Brown County. And though his observations are clearly covered by the prejudices of the day, he does offer detailed descriptions of Kickapoo language and religious practices and genealogy and other matters. And we have his papers in our collection, and they're still used by scholars today. The Kickapoo Training School. So he had a photographer. I'll mention him in a second, take photographs. So here we see a photograph of the Kickapoo Training School, and it was here Kickapoo students were furnished with room, board, and clothing, with the Kickapoo averaging the average school attendance, that is, being about 70 at the time of Custer's visit. And it was located on a 240-acre working farm. Clearly, the goal of this school, as with other government-funded Indian schools of the era, was acculturation into contemporary American life. That is, molding future westernized farmers and farm wives. But in doing so, the students had to reject, right, indigenous lifeways and their language, right? They were stripped of that. They were forcibly removed from their homes. We being Western societies, right, are only now beginning to come to terms with this erasure of a peoples, right? The Canadian federal government, in Australia, there have been formal apologies. We're beginning to see that in the United States as well. Milo Custer hired, when he was in Horton, Kansas, Brown County, Kansas, a photographer, German-American Ernest Hoppe. A photograph, of course, is never the objective truth, and especially when you consider photographs of Native people. It's the process of cultural and social interaction that's occurring behind the camera as well as in front of the camera always has to be kind of examined, right? Why is the photograph being taken? Who's taking the photograph? What's the motivation of the photographer? Are these photographs being sold? Things of that nature, right? So we must approach photographs of indigenous people carefully, critically, and understanding their context and aware of the power of these images, right? And the potential for misuse, well-intentioned or not. Fortunately, there seems to be Ernest Hoppe, the photographer. These are people given a level of dignity, a sense of their own self here. And I think I will leave it at that. In 2008, 2009, the McLean County Museum of History, where I work, right, we staged an exhibit titled The Unconquerable. And central to that exhibit were the Brown County photos that Ernest Hoppe took, that Milo Custer contracted out in October 1906. And for that exhibit opening, a group of Kansas Kickapoo traveled to Bloomington. But during the past several years, the museum where I work, we forged new and closer ties to the Kansas Kickapoo, led primarily by our curator of digital humanities, Tori Moray, who kind of forged a relationship with Lester Randall, the tribal chairman in Kansas, right? So in the summer of 2019, museum staffers, our curator of exhibits, Susan Hartzold, our marketing director, Jeb Woodard, and Tori made a trip down there because the Kickapoo were opening up an exhibit in one of their public or community buildings. The staff, while there, brought a bur oak tree indigenous to Central Illinois as a gift and attended a dance or a powwow. And Lester Randall, the tribal chairman, has made several visits to Central Illinois. We gave a program together pre-COVID-19 pandemic in El Paso, as you see here. We had the Kickapoo partner with us in the creation of a digital interactive in one of our 5 permanent exhibits. This exhibit is called A Community in Conflict, where we look at the issue of power. And in this particular exhibit, we look at the intergenerational trauma the Kickapoo have faced through treaties. And we did not want to tell the story of the Kickapoo. We wanted the Kickapoo to tell their own story, right? Being evicted from their ancestral homelands, having their children forcibly taken away, not being allowed to practice their traditions or speak their language. Repatriation, right? The process whereby important cultural items and even human remains are returned to lineal descendants or descendant communities, right? So this document was once held, there's actually 2 copies that have since been repatriated, right? Was held in the Milo Custer collection. It's a warrant or order by a U.S. Indian agent to seize and then return a young female student to the Kickapoo school, where, quote, she shall remain during the time of school, which closes June 30th, 1893. That's 8 months at the school away from her parents and elders, right? So after a conversation with Lester Randall, the tribal chairman, and other Kickapoo, there was agreement to repatriate, return this warrant and the copy back to the Kansas Kickapoo. And I know some of you perhaps are thinking, what's the big deal, right? But at the museum, right, we talk about respecting the power, the emotion of an object, right? In this case, a piece of paper. Think about your own home, what's on your shelf, your dresser in your bedroom, what's on a shelf in your living room, and how important that particular object is, or that document, right? Well, this particular document is incredibly potent for the Kickapoo, and repatriation, I believe, was the right thing to do. Let's look at a Google map. Let's reorient ourselves as we wrap up the program. I've got about 5-10 minutes here. You folks have been super patient as always. Google map, we see Leroy here, and then north and a little east of Leroy is the Grand Village of the Kickapoo site, right? So some of you might have visited this 2+ acre Grand Village of the Kickapoo Park site, right? Especially when it was the site of an annual powwow beginning in the 1990s. There were several historical markers there commemorating the village, the Grand Village of the Kickapoo, and also the Kickapoo people. So let's enlarge that, and we see 3 things here, right? We see the Grand Village of the Kickapoo outlined there, the Grand Village of the Kickapoo Park, a 2+ acre parcel. We see the stockade marker. I'm going to wrap up with that, so put that aside. And then we see a 20-acre little postage stamp, a piece of a wooded tract. That's West Park, named for Simeon West, and owned by the county of McLean. And we'll get there in just a moment here. Okay, so the 2+ acre Grand Village of the Kickapoo Park once served as the focal point for efforts to commemorate local indigenous history generally, and the Kickapoo and the Grand Village in particular. The annual powwow was managed by local folk, local people, and the Kansas Kickapoo, as far as I know, generally did not sponsor or play a primary role in the gathering, so they did maintain a presence often. But here's the rub, right? Although the site was zoned, this 2-acre+ site was zoned for public events to host the powwow, the Grand Village of the Kickapoo Park, right? Those who ran the annual powwow never owned the park grounds. The Grand Village site was part of a much larger parcel. Here we see the Illinois State Historical Society marker, which stood at the Grand Village of the Kickapoo Park, the powwow ground site. It was erected by sponsored by the History Club of Lexington High School, and was dedicated back in 1999. It no longer stands, and I'll talk about that in a second. The site was extensively wired for electricity, the powwow, the park site, because it doubled as a campground during the powwow. There was also a well for potable water, tree plantings, and open shelter, and other landscaping improvements. Then about 2 years ago, the park site and all the adjacent acreage were put up for sale. That owner and then the new and current owner expressed no interest in subdividing this parcel, the Grand Village of the Kickapoo Park site, subdividing that parcel and selling it to a third party. Then we learned last spring, summer, that the new owner who purchased the acreage, including the powwow site, intended to convert the park into crops or pasture or some other economic use related to a large farming operation. And again, there's no criticism whatsoever here publicly of the owner. It always wasn't private property, and we must respect that. So with the announcement, though, that the Kickapoo Powwow Ground Park site was going to be converted into productive agricultural land, we had a couple weeks to remove the signage, right? We wanted to do the right thing. We found, though, that several trees, we're not sure if they were planted for the park site, but had been dedicated to Kickapoo elders, such as here we see George Kakishtian Jr. Here's David Hall, a museum friend on the left, and Norris Porter, our development director, on the right with the Illinois State Historical Society marker. We had to remove that. Removing a marker was one thing. Removing a massive granite boulder was another thing entirely, right? And it had a beautiful, or it does have a beautiful statement etched onto it by tribal elder John Kiskaski on one side, and it reads in part, quote, "This park is dedicated to those ancestors which lived and died here, a great nation that once called this place home." So as I said, picking this up proved a little more challenging. Luckily, we had Brian Hannafin, there we see him, and his uncle, Mike Hannafin. Brian is a member of the local machine operators union, and his uncle Mike owns True Value in Leroy, and also the historic Princess Theater in Leroy. If you haven't been to the Princess Theater to see a movie, please do so soon, right? So let's go back to that map. All of that, the boulder and the Illinois State Historical Society marker with their Grand Village site. So where are we going to move those, right? We want to do what is right to the great story, the epic story of the Kickapoo people. Well, luckily, the county of McLean just happened to have a park, a 20-acre park, less than a mile away from the powwow ground site. Within the general environs of the Grand Village site. It made absolute perfect sense to relocate the boulder there. And then what we did was rewrite an Illinois State Historical Society marker. The language had to be updated a little bit, and the site was slightly different. And then dedicate a new State Historical Society marker. So there is Uncle Mike Hannafin to the right, and our development director, Norris Porter. A shout out to Norris. It was Norris who led the charge on this entire project, and without Norris Porter being an employee at the museum, none of this would have happened, I assure you, right? We had to receive clearly approval by the county, the board of the county of McLean, to relocate the boulder there at West Park, and then also to erect a new Illinois State Historical Society sign. You see the West Park Pavilion behind you that was damaged in a windstorm last fall. That has since been repaired. There's a new roof on that pavilion. So the county really cleaned up the park grounds, knowing that we were going to rededicate these things. West Park was donated by McLean County resident Simon West in the early 1900s, and it's a vestige of Old Town timber, right? Which was just adjacent to the Grand Village. It's a postage stamp, as I said, county park, though the back 10 acres are relatively undisturbed, a relatively undisturbed remnant when it was a wooded grove. And it's, so again, it's it's really a wonderful location to place the boulders. Here we see the relocation work occurring last September. And to the right, notice that's a monument to West Park, which was erected by Simeon West, the park's namesake. You could do a whole lecture on Simeon West. And that marker or monument includes two statements. One reads, "The groves are God's own temples." And the other reads, "Let us worship at the shrine of nature." And there is Simeon West, again, who donated 20 acres to the county of McLean back in 1906. And here he is by a monument erected several years later to his memory. And that monument is still there and is next to the Kickapoo boulder and the Illinois State Historical Society marker commemorating the Grand Village of the Kickapoo today. So beautiful. If you find yourself out in eastern McLean County, please pay a visit to West Park. And there's the dedication several months ago in June. There's our executive director, Julie Emig, to the left there. And there's the new Illinois State Historical Society marker. We also had the Kansas Kickapoo help us write the marker. Again, we do not want to speak for the Kickapoo. We want them to tell their story. So as we wrap up here, folks, let's go back to that Google satellite view, Grand Village of the Kickapoo, West Park, which we just left. And we're going to end at the stockade marker. We haven't talked about that at all. Stockade marker, you say? Yes. It's the oldest historical marker commemorating the Grand Village of the Kickapoo. And it's not at the former Powwow Park site. No, it's a half a mile away, smack in the middle of privately owned cropland. And this is the view from County Road 3100 East. And it's the closest you can really get because everything else is private property until you get to the monument itself. And that little parcel surrounding the monument is owned by the McLean County Museum of History. Visit the site several times, right? I was there in 2020. Luckily, the field was in beans. But if you go back and it's in corn, you're not even going to get a glimpse of the monument, right? Archaeological work was conducted by Illinois State University at the marker site in the 1970s. And where the marker is, where this marker is actually closer to the proximity of most of the activity in the Grand Village, though the Grand Village itself would kind of shift around from season to season. The marker reads, "Site of stockaded Kickapoo Indian Fort." Well, what could that mean, right? And notice it sits on a 33 by 33 foot parcel, again, owned by the museum where I work. So there was a stockade, we know, or a wooden palisade, which was part of the Grand Village site. It didn't encompass the entire Grand Village, but was part of it. And it encompassed an area of about 180 by 300 feet. And you say stockade, or I say stockade or fort, and that's likely inaccurate or incomplete because this wooden palisade, perhaps it did serve defensive purposes for the Kickapoo people, but early Euro-American settlers also noted that the area enclosed by the stockade was covered in bluegrass. Well, what does that mean, right? It tells us that it was used as an enclosure for horses. And you're probably thinking, well, now I'm really confused, right? Bluegrass and horses are confined within this stockade or palace, right? Well, bluegrass is not indigenous to central Illinois, so evidence tells us that the bluegrass seed might have made its way via what? Horse manure, right? So the Kickapoo, we know, managed large herds of horses, right? They were known for borrowing horses long-term from white settlers and other indigenous peoples. This marker, as I said, is closer to the main center of activity for the Kickapoo village. So, in a symbolic gesture that carries a little bit of potency, the McLean County Museum of History last fall decided with the board approval to deed 49% of the stockade marker plot, what you're seeing here, this 33 by 33 foot parcel, 49% of that to the Kickapoo of Kansas. Purely symbolic, but still potent, right? The Kickapoo have at least symbolically a little bit of central Illinois land that had been stolen from them in the 18 teens and 1820s and into the 1830s. Thank you very much for your time. You've been patient, and I look forward to your questions or comments.
Thank you, Bill. Do you want me to go ahead and start reading the comment or the questions and comments for you? All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So Bill, another Bill, asks, if any, what further Kickapoo related initiatives are planned for West Park? For example, a joint project with the Kickapoo people to maybe establish a cultural center for multiple potential uses, etc.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. What is planned as far as the Kickapoo, right? We're just a museum here in Central Illinois. How about the Kickapoo themselves, right? This is the story. We had hoped to bring, we had invited the Kickapoo of Kansas to come up for the dedication. They weren't able to do that, right? They've got plenty of work to do, right? They're being pulled in many directions. I know Norris Porter, our development director, Tori Moore, our curator of digital humanities, and others are continuing a dialogue to the Kickapoo to bring them here, perhaps in the spring, sometime soon, to formally consecrate, if you will, West Park and the Kickapoo Boulder and Illinois State Historical Society marker, to have a gathering there. As far as a cultural center, I mean, everything is open to discussion. The only hurdle or obstacle is, of course, is that there aren't large numbers of Kickapoo in Central Illinois today, right? So to have meetings, right, in the digital era, there is Zoom, of course, and all of that, but still, nonetheless, I know the Kickapoo have expressed at least initial interest in perhaps purchasing a little parcel somewhere in Central Illinois. They do have a little bit of income. They've been buying up land in Kansas, for example. So they're very smart in how they use the funds that they have. So there are opportunities for interaction, and we're open to suggestions from people as well.
Okay, the next question is from Mark. Do you know anything about the settlements that were located just east of Hayworth? Were those also Kickapoo settlements?
Yeah, so east of Hayworth. I mean, I'm not quite sure to honestly answer. I don't pretend to be, a scholar on Indigenous history, especially locally. So I view myself in some ways as more of a popularizer, a librarian who wants to get people excited about subjects. But if I have more time during this lecture, I do take a deeper dive into previous Indigenous history. I look at a Mississippian village more than 700 years ago north of present-day Hayworth, the Noble Weeding site, which would be, again, north of Hayworth and Randolph Township. That's a wonderful story. And Dr. Logan Miller at Illinois State University is taking an ISHU field school out there every spring, late spring, early summer, learning a lot of really interesting things, right? Cutting edge archaeological work is occurring every year now in McLean County. Greg Coos, to sell his book again, opens up his book in 1730 with the siege and massacre of the Meskwaki people in eastern McLean County, right? The people of the Red Earth, or the Fox Indians, who were fleeing French dominion and found themselves in eastern McLean County being hounded by the Fox and their Indian allies and then slaughtered on the open prairie, right? That's the first recorded event in McLean County history. That tells you that Indigenous and Euro-American relations were just written in blood. So a lot of history here, but I don't know the specifics about villages or sites east of Hayworth, unfortunately. I still have a lot to learn.
Karen asks if there's any books on Silas.
On what?
On Silas, Silas.
On Silas. I don't remember bringing up Silas. There's Milo Custer, perhaps. I'm not sure. Maybe the person asking the question could clarify that a little bit. So I apologize.
Let's go to the next one. Any interaction with Kickapoo tribes in Oklahoma, Texas, and northern Mexico?
Yeah, that's something we have not done. So, we're a small not-for-profit. We're overextended ourselves, but we've been encouraged by people to reach out to the Oklahoma Kickapoo. So that's something certainly that we know we need to do. And we really haven't done yet. So yes, it's nice to be reminded of that.
And Karen clarified the gentleman for West Park. I think it was Simeon.
Oh, Simeon West. Yeah. Anybody can contact me, right? You can get my email address on our website very easily, or the phone number. We do have resources on Simeon West, the donor of West Park. Simeon West was a spiritualist. So the Kickapoo statue at Kiwanis Park in downtown Leroy, that's a Simeon West donation. That's a wonderful story. So if anybody wants to learn a little bit more about Simeon West, he was a conservationist, clearly had an interest in indigenous people and was a spiritualist and one of the many very colorful, interesting people in county history. Just give me a call or send me an email and I can help out.
Bill now asks, what kind of interaction with the Illinois tribes historically and currently?
Do we have? Yeah, we do not have any, as I'm aware, again, the extent of our contact, meaningful contact with indigenous people currently is strictly with the Kickapoo. So, and again, there's much we could be doing, but we're not only a museum of indigenous history, right? We're a museum of contemporary McLean County history. So, we're currently undertaking an oral history project for the local LGBTQ plus community. So history for us is today because that will be history tomorrow. So we've got a huge fields to cover and we can only do so much, but there's more certainly we can do in that field.
Rose says, to the east of Arrowsmith on the way to Saybrook, there is a French Indian war site. Is this related to the Kickapoo?
No, that is what I did mention the massacre, the siege and massacre of the Meskwaki people, the people of the Red Earth, or the Fox Indians. That's 1730, July, August, and September of 1730. The Fox are surrounded. A siege is laid. They attempt to flee the night of September 8th and 9th and are massacred on the open prairie. So that boulder you see in eastern McLean County, not all that far from the grand village of the Kickapoo, though it's considerably, it's a little bit earlier than the Kickapoo story is. That's related to that massacre of 1730, and it's not the Kickapoo.
And Joanne is asking, where exactly is West Park?
Yeah, I can't give directions off the top of my head. It's not easy to find. It is east. It's on the eastern edge of Moraine View State Park. So that's kind of the best way to explain it. So going to a road map or going to any of the digital maps, it is identified. So I can't give specific directions, but the best way to get there is to take the blacktop from Downs east, and you can almost get to West Park from there. It's a beautiful drive atop the Bloomington Moraine. So, but unfortunately, I can't give specific directions.
Rose clarifies, she said West Park is on 3000 East.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Take 800 West to 3000 East is what she says. All right. Do we have any more questions? We're getting comments that, it's a great informative presentation, timely presentation, and it was great. If anyone has any questions, I'm just going to wait just a second in case someone's typing. But thank you all for joining us tonight. And of course, thank you, Bill. We certainly appreciate the museum's work and their active involvement in our community.
And I'll see everybody at Greg's Talk a week from today.
Thank you.